Okay, let's move this as much out of the way as we can. And away we go. All right, so here we are as we look the first of five parts of period 4, 1800 to 1848. The first part here is the age of Jefferson, okay? And as we look here with Thomas Jefferson, let's start off by talking about a couple of things. Number one, after he wins this very contentious election in 1800, settled in the House of Representatives, the so-called Revolution of 1800. What does Jefferson say in his inaugural address, which is very conciliatory to his Federalist adversaries? We are all Federalists, we are all Republicans. And he attempted in that first administration, his first term, which was very successful, to try to live by that. Keeping a lot of the Federalist agenda in place, such as it kept the national bank, it continued to finance the national debt. He respected the Washington and then Adams policy of neutrality to the war in Europe. But at the same time, we also saw a lot of Republican policies as well. He only appointed Republicans in his cabinet. I know sometimes they use the term Democratic Republicans. Sometimes you even hear National Republicans. Jefferson also repealed the excise taxes, which would be mainly the whiskey tax in Pennsylvania, the national land taxes that existed. He, of course, got rid of the Alien and Sedition Act and let everybody that was jailed underneath that out of jail. Remember, what was Jefferson's view of government? A wise and frugal government, a government that governs least, governs best, okay? Governs best, governs least. And so you did see that the federal bureaucracy got smaller, the number of jobs got smaller, government spending became less. You saw a decrease in the national debt. When you talk about Jefferson's first administration, this is our big thing, right? The Louisiana Purchase. We cannot underscore how important this was. Remember, Pinckney Treaty of 1795 opened up the Mississippi River that Spain had closed. Remember, it had closed New Orleans, and it allowed Americans the right of deposit. Remember, the West is becoming more and more important. We are moving west, moving west. We talked about the Treaty of Greenville and Anthony Wayne and Fallen Timbers in period 4. The West was being more and more opened up to white settlement. And so with Spain now under Napoleon's control, and Napoleon wanting to reassert control over Louisiana, New Orleans, because he wants to reestablish that French colonial empire. Before it went back to France, Spain closed our right of deposit, in effect negating a lot of economic opportunity that would have been present and all of this new Western territory, what would become Western states. So Jefferson sent American foreign ministers to France to negotiate the right to purchase the port of New Orleans. Now, at this point, Napoleon had given up on reestablishing a French empire in North America because of the war with Great Britain occupying most of his time and resources, and the disaster from a French point of view of the revolution. Did that get on here? Sorry, that's embarrassing. I thought his name was on here. The revolution that, there it is. Sorry, C- in French. Toussaint Louverture. It's terrible. I'm sorry. No disrespect. But in losing Haiti, that idea of reestablishing a French colonial empire disappeared, and in desperate need of some payola to fight the war with Britain, the American delegation to France was met with the opportunity of, hey, $15 million you can have all of Louisiana. Like you can have all French claims this side of the Mississippi River. Immediately, the American delegation accepted. They could not believe the offer. And Jefferson agreed and got past his own Republican, strict constructionist point of view by saying, well, the Constitution doesn't really say the president can buy territories, and he totally rejected the idea of Hamilton's, implied powers. I said, well, buying land is more or less making a treaty. And despite the opposition from Federalists, right, and his own, where are the Quids? Quids, right, who would have been old school Republicans that thought that Jefferson was betraying traditional Republican principles and very limited government and frugal government. Jefferson went ahead with it, and it passed easily by the Republican-dominated Senate. This shows that the Federalists are becoming more and more obsolete politically, basically having all of their power in New England, but only being, as one book describes it, able to complain about Jefferson's policies. And remember, too, when we talk about Jefferson and Venerate the Plow and an empire for liberty, Jefferson is all about getting the Louisiana Purchase because he believes that the future of the nation would be best served by having as many yeoman small farmers as possible, because remember, economic independence made one politically independent. You were a good, stable citizen. You had a stake in society. So Jefferson goes ahead with that. The other issue, very minor in Jefferson's first administration, is the war with the Barbary pirates. The Barbary states are the states of North Africa, which for years, had practiced state-sanctioned piracy. It was their number one form of income. Shakedown, extortion in the Med, right? Washington's administration, Adams' administration paid them off. Jefferson doesn't really want to do that. He's willing to go along with the program until the ruler of Tripoli, the leading Barbary state, jacked up the price of tribute, to which Jefferson sent a small armed force, primarily Navy. And for about 4 years, they banged it out in the Mediterranean. And there were a couple of land battles, of course, the Marine Corps theme, to the shores of Tripoli. There's really nothing decisive, but there's enough of an increased military presence there from the Americans that the worst of the abuses by the Barbary states stopped. Jefferson wins pretty easily in his bid for re-election in 1804. In fact, he wins easily. What do I mean? Pretty easily. But his second administration is a living hell, right? Why? Because of foreign affairs. Remember, we talked about the most important industry in America in the early 19th century was? That's right, shipping, right? We are a commerce-based nation. Shipping and all shipping-related industries and all the trades that are tied to shipping is the most important part of the American economy. And with Britain and France at each other's throat, in a war for survival in continental Europe really being fought around the world, each side refused to allow American ships to trade with the other. Each side is France seizing ships bound for Britain, and really seizing American ships everywhere, and Britain doing the same. And for Britain, they are also impressing American sailors. We talked about in class, right? Nobody wants to volunteer for a British man of war back in the early 19th century, a floating hell as they were described. And Britain did not recognize the right of any of its citizens to renounce their citizenship. And so Britain, seeing that British sailors had, deserted the Royal Navy, taken much better paid jobs and better conditions on American merchant vessels, began impressing American sailors. And as we said in class, I don't have my notes in front of me, what was the number, 4,000, 4 or 5,000? Several thousand Americans were impressed during this time period. And we almost had a war in 1807, the Chesapeake Leopard Affair. Chesapeake is an American merchant ship. HMS Leopard is a British ship that had been impressing American sailors, and as they were taunted by former British deserters on the Chesapeake, they fired on it. Some Americans were killed, some were impressed, and there was a lot of call for war. And it was Jefferson who was not too keen on America going to war, even though he is much more sympathetic to France. He decides the action would be the embargo, which was no American ship could sail to any foreign port. And it was a peaceful coercion, right? The idea that Britain needed our trade, right? We're Britain's largest trading partner. France needed our trade, and that they would cease these illegal American seizures if we, turn the screw economically. Well, it didn't work. Law of unintended consequences. Whose economy was wrecked by the embargo? Oh, that's right, America's. Particularly what region was devastated by the embargo? That's right, New England. And of course, what political party is there in New England? The Federalists. And after 2 years of protest, on sort of the last day in office, Jefferson was able to have the embargo repealed, and his successor, James Madison, another Democratic Republican, sponsored the Non-Intercourse Act, which meant that American ships could go to foreign ports. It just couldn't go to a British, it couldn't go to a French port. And the next year, famous Makin's Bill number 2, because people were still so upset, and Britain's our largest trading partner, we said if any country, if Britain or France agrees to respect our neutral rights, we'll trade with them, but not trade with their enemy. And Napoleon said, oh, fine, we'll respect neutral rights. And even though it was a gigantic ruse, we were so eager to accept that we reestablished trade with France and would not trade with Britain. And it was also justified by the fact that the French were not impressing American sailors. Well, tied into this anti-British fervor we see down here is this stuff, okay? Where as Americans are continuing pushing further and further west, particularly after the Treaty of Greenville, you saw the last real armed Indian resistance movement this side of the Mississippi River, where 2 Shawnee brothers, right, Tecumseh and the Prophet, I can't pronounce the Prophet's real name, Tekextawanawana. Remember, he was described in the old textbook as a fat, one-eyed alcoholic who fell asleep in a drunken stupor and had a vision, right? And so the vision of the Prophet is to return to traditional Indian ways of living, renounce alcohol, and it's like a cultural revival movement, right? That will return to driving out the white man. And Tecumseh starts the military confederation east of the Mississippi led by the Shawnee. Well, in 1811, that confederacy is defeated by William Henry Harrison at the Battle of Tippecanoe. But during that, even though the British didn't provide a lot of direct assistance to Tecumseh, the fact that the British still occupy territory in the Old Northwest, they have outposts in Canada, that the frontier, which has become so important to America and westward migration, western settlement, the British take the blame for it. And remember, frontier warfare is god awful. So with all of this stuff, you have a lot of people that are eager for war, including the new congressmen, the war hawks from the South and the West, most notably Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun. Henry Clay and Calhoun, that are clamoring for war against Britain. And not only do they see it as a way to establish the total independence of the United States, but remember, even though we only have 7.5 million people, what do we have our eyes on? Canada, right? And so, and one of the great ironies, everybody's like, oh yeah, Battle of New Orleans was after the Treaty of Ghent, right? How stupid. Well, in reality, Britain had rescinded their orders of council, which prohibited American trade with the continent, before we even declared war. Yet nevertheless, we had already declared war, and so now it was on. And remember, when we talk about the War of 1812, a couple of things to remember. 3 horrifically failed land campaigns to invade Canada. All totally disastrous, right? And remember, they were very, very ill-conceived. Okay, we burned some buildings in York, modern-day Toronto, and that would come back to bite us as well. But they are unequivocal disasters. The one spot that we have some success during the War of 1812 was actually on the seas, whether it was old Ironsides, the Constitution winning some battles. What did it sink? Come on. HMS Guerriere. Remember, that was the famous painting we looked at in class, right? So the Constitution winning battles against Rule Britannia on the high seas, the sort of impromptu ad hoc shipbuilding program, and we control the Great Lakes. The famous Battle of Lake Erie, Oliver Hazard Perry. We have met the enemy and they are ours, right? Thomas MacDonough, who wins the battle on Lake Champlain. So the British plot to invade us through Canada is squashed, right? But, we get smoked pretty good. By 1814, Napoleon is defeated. They invade the Chesapeake. We all know what happened to Washington, D.C. And we are just able to hang on, right? As we've got, the Star-Spangled Banner and Francis Scott Key. Baltimore is able to withstand the shelling of Fort McHenry. The war in the West goes better against the Indians, where at the Battle of Thames River, Tecumseh is defeated. He had become a British ally, and we talked about this was the last time a foreign power helped Indians fight the United States government, and it's the last time Indians posed any real challenge east of the Mississippi, because the Creek Confederacy is busted by Andrew Jackson in the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, right? And of course, the British, after their failed Chesapeake campaign, decide, well, we'll invade the American South, we'll cut off the Mississippi River, this will get us some concessions. And on Christmas Eve, 1814, the Treaty of Ghent is signed. Madison has seen the writing on the wall, we can't win. The British just fought this nonstop war for about 20 years. All they want is peace and to rebuild a sense of normalcy at home. They realize that it's very difficult to win as well. And so December 24th, 1814, status quo antebellum, the Treaty of Ghent. Canada's border is respected. All land is returned. But word traveled slow. And of course, General Pakenham landed at New Orleans. Andrew Jackson with his motley crew of frontiersmen, Creoles, freed slaves, pirates, right? Remember we learned in class about how they had the fortified redoubts, and the British just marched up and were mowed down. And it was such a decisive battle. What are the numbers? 2,000 British casualties to 71, 78 Americans. It was such a resounding victory that it contributed to, what did we call that in class? The myth of victory. And so as we look at this War of 1812, even though it's status quo antebellum, all of the long-term consequences that took place, we already viewed what happened with the Indians. We accept Canada, right, and British Canada, but there's no more British meddling in our Northwest. We talk about the increased nationalism in the United States. You'll certainly see that in the practice DBQ. It's just so cliche to say, oh, Americans gain respect of Europe. Well, we're still bumpkins, right? We're still rubes, we're still Yankees, but we never see any interference until Germans in 1915, by restricting American trade. So the United States is able to develop that part of our economy, which is a very important part of our economy. The rise in Anglophobia that we had talked about in class, lingering sentiments against the British. It demonstrated, it sort of kickstarted the American economy as we had to manufacture things on our own. It exposed all of the weaknesses of the American economy because it's going to be a catalyst for, what did Henry Clay call that? Government helping economic development? The American system, and that's in our next section, right? So there are so many important benefits. And oh yes, remember, this is the death knell of the Federalist Party, right? Because as war was declared, it was a very close vote. It was pretty much a Southern and Western thing, with New York and Pennsylvania also voting for the war. Remember, how many Federalists voted to go to war in 1812? Let me see. Zero, right? And you had a lot of states like Maryland that were split. We had the famous riots in Baltimore. And as the war was not going very well and a convention was called in Hartford, the Federalist hotheads wanted to secede, and there was no secession adopted by the official Hartford Convention, but they did want to weaken the political power of the West and of the Democratic Republican Party for calling for things like two-thirds majorities necessary to do things like go to war. And as the war was won after the Battle of New Orleans, all of a sudden they look like losers. They look like traitors. Word had gotten out that people were talking of secession. And the Hartford Convention is the death knell of the Federalists as a national party, because remember, in 1816, who's elected? Oh yeah, James Monroe. What did that start politically? The era of good feelings, right? And one party rule. I think I got everything. No, I missed that. Boom. Last thing. All right. So one thing that I missed, and just off my A game today, was in Jefferson's first administration, while we were all Federalists and all Republicans, Jefferson supported the movement within his party to kick out Federalist judges, right? Impeach them. Because remember, when you're a federal judge, your appointment is for how long? Lifetime, right? And remember, too, the Federalists had all of the federal court appointments, and John Adams, on his way to sling, what would be the right word? Scurry out of town, right? Not attend the inauguration, which Thomas Jefferson walked the parade route, by the way. Remember, humility to the White House, answer the door in his own slippers, right? As opposed to someone else's slippers, he answered the door himself, even wearing slippers, informal dinners. You got it, all right? As you can tell, yeah, I didn't go to MIT. So, Adams had these last-second appointees, the midnight judges, right? And Jefferson not only supported the impeachment movement, and they got rid of Thomas Pickering, who was nuts, right? These really highly partisan Federalist judges. He was impeached. He was a federal judge, and they tried to impeach a Supreme Court Justice, Salmon P. Chase. No, not Salmon P. Chase. Why can't I remember this off the top of my head? No, I think it was Chase, right? Yeah, it was Chase. I'm sorry. And that movement fizzled out because there were no high crimes or misdemeanors. But nevertheless, Jefferson also supported not giving commissions to the midnight judges. And one of those judges was Mr. Marbury. And Marbury said, I am going to sue the President of the United States, right? He sues his Secretary of State, who was supposed to deliver these commissions, James Madison. And because of the Judiciary Act of 1789, the Supreme Court had original jurisdiction on any lawsuit dealing with the President of the United States. And you're probably thinking, well, they don't have that anymore. Yeah, because it was declared unconstitutional. So the Federal Chief Justice, John Marshall, in hearing the case said, yeah, Mr. Marbury should be granted his commission, but I can't enforce it. It's not up to me to enforce, because the law that gives me the right to make a decision on this case, the Judiciary Act of 1789, is repugnant to the Constitution. It supersedes what the Supreme Court can do. It's a violation of separation of powers, and the Supreme Court should not have original jurisdiction on the executive branch. Congress did not have a right to do that overstepped their constitutional bounds. So Marshall, who is a hardcore Federalist, right, decides, all right, look, I'm not going to take the easy way out. I'm going to say, look, I don't have the power to rule here. But by not having the power to rule here, he vastly expands the federal court, the power of the Supreme Court, by creating the process known as judicial review, which, as we'll look in that means that actions of the president, actions of Congress can be declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. We'll also look later on at remember in Cohen versus Virginia a few years later, that was the DC lottery tickets, that the Supreme Court established that the right of judicial review also extended to the states, i.e., state criminal law can be reviewed by the Supreme Court. Because remember, before we had judicial review, it was all up to the states deciding what was constitutional, supposedly, with the Virginia and Kentucky resolves. Okay, I think I hit everything. Yeah, yeah. All right, so we're on to the next page. Close this out. Hold on.